Good morning, everybody. You're listening to The Menu on UCLAradio.com. This is your host, Belize, and we have a very special guest with us today. Kae Whalen is the Beverage Program Director of Kismet. Hello.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. So we're going to be talking about natural wine and being the beverage director and everything related to the industry today. So to start off, like a lot of people have several like misconceptions about natural wine.
Sure.
How would you describe it?
Well, I mean, one thing that I think I'm starting to talk to people more about is how it's not a style. I think that's something important to recognize. I think a lot of people associate natural wine with kind of the extremes, but really, you know, natural wine is just wine pre-industrialized farming and pre a lot of the chemicals that were developed and introduced in the 60s and 70s. So, you know, before the second half of the last century, this was just how wine was made. But to kind of simplify it, it's basically nothing added, nothing taken away. That's something that people like to, like a nice simple way to explain it. But, you know, to kind of go into a little bit more detail, it starts with farming, and, you know, wine is an agricultural product, which is, I think, something that people forget. And when you're making wine with a sort of more traditional or natural approach, the idea is to let nature kind of do its thing, which is not to say that you're not farming. I mean, obviously that's a human intervention, but, you know, you're not adding a bunch of pesticides, synthetic chemicals, things like that. No one's in a hazmat suit spraying the vines to keep the pests away. And then in the cellar, you are also not adding chemicals. So there's all kinds of stuff that people put in conventional wine, and it's more than just like sugar and different like acidifiers and things like that. There's like dyes and powdered tannins and all of these things, and that's not included in natural wine.
Why do you think that was the way it was in the first place?
I mean, partially just because the chemicals did not exist, but also I think, you know, if you think about a place like the Loire Valley, which is a region in the northwestern part of France that follows the Loire River, it's a huge agricultural center. So it's kind of like, if you think about it, like the Central Valley of France, like it's the breadbasket. It's where a lot of food comes from. And so wine growing there was part and parcel of kind of a more you know, polycultural approach, like in term, you know, growing not just grapes, but having livestock and growing different types of orchard, like orchard fruit and things like that, which, you know, kind of contributes to a healthier soil, like a more diverse ecosystem that kind of checks itself. You know, you have livestock that provides natural compost. And helps to like keep the soil healthy, not just with their natural compost, but with you know, eating the cover crops and kind of stomping the soil and doing all these things that kind of allow you to do a little bit less as a farmer. But you know, it's a little bit, it's complicated. You're doing less, but it also requires a lot more kind of patience and you know, capacity for risk and things like that.
And there are also a lot of like prejudgments or like preconceived notions about natural wine. Like, it's like better for you, or it doesn't. I read that somewhere that it doesn't give you hangovers.
I mean, that's not
how
true.
much. Yeah, how much of that is actually true?
I mean, it's like, you know, like we were saying earlier, it's still alcohol. It's still you know, they're definitely for the most part a lot lower in alcohol than something like a conventional Napa Cab at like 15 ABV, like alcohol by volume. And then you have something like most natural wine is lower than that. it's like an average of 12%. There's definitely exceptions. There's definitely some like high octane natural wine. But that's one thing. I feel like maybe that's why a lot of people associate it with that. And then, I mean, definitely the hangover is not as bad. You know, you're not consuming a bunch of additives when you're drinking natural wine, or at least, you know, wine that's truly made without any kind of additions. Because there are some, like, there's some, you know, one of my, you know, friends and mentors refers to it as natural enough. There's definitely like this kind of in between where people are noticing that there's a huge market for this, and some wine that's maybe not quite as rigorous is being categorized that way, and so some of that wine might give you more of a hangover. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it's definitely, I mean, you can drink a lot more of it and feel a lot better the next day than with conventional wine for sure. But it's not like you won't get drunk, and it's not like you won't get a hangover. Definitely happens. Wine's expensive for most people. Even retail, you know, something over $20 can feel like a lot. So one thing that, you know, we've tried to do at Kismet is give people an opportunity to drink some of the wines from our bottle list at a really accessible price point. So during the weekdays, we do $10 glasses from 12 to 6, and I do like a little selection. Usually it's new releases from one producer, because I like to kind of showcase the different dimensions of one producer, or it'll be like a couple producers who are all related to each other in some way, like mentors, or, you know, part of the same community. So it's kind of a nice way for people to get a chance to try stuff that we don't normally have open, at a you know, a nice price point.
And I kind of want to talk about a couple of, I guess, struggles or problems within the wine industry.
Sure.
We talked a little bit about accessibility, but recently sexual harassment and assault has been a big issue.
Yeah.
And I've also read recently the New York Times article about Kae Whalen and the people that came forward. And even though that happened in New York, it also started this conversation in Los Angeles as well.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that, first of all?
I mean, you know, like with any industry, there's definitely been kind of a reckoning, which I think is really important. I think that the fact that the wine industry in particular involves people drinking definitely makes it a little bit more of a powder keg, and that's something that I've been aware of, you know, long before, I mean, that everyone's been aware of long before any of this started coming out, because it's not just, you know, like when you're working for someone, that's one thing, but also, you know, sometimes winemakers are coming from you know, out of town, and there's different cultural norms and a lot of kind of sticking points there. And then again, like when you add alcohol into the mix, it can be I've definitely been in my share of uncomfortable situations. But I think that in terms of like what I think about it, I think that the most important thing right now is that the conversation keeps going. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like everybody, you know, having a round table about it on a regular basis. But I think what really is important is when you're in a situation where people are drinking and it's a semi-professional situation, because sometimes it's outside of work. Sometimes it's like, you know, you get the chance to taste some wines at someone's house or at a tasting or something like that. And it's outside of like the structure of a workplace. It's so important that people, especially men, pay attention to what's going on around them, say something. If someone seems uncomfortable, check in on them. I mean, it's pretty easy to take care of people and to take care of your community. And I've been lucky enough to be in situations where, you know, someone kind of bailed me out, and then another friend who was also at that party reached out to me the next day. Like, you know, there are ways to make someone feel taken care of and safe, and I think that that's really important.
And in terms of like grapes and stuff, what do you think what's your favorite, or like what do you think students who are looking for something cheaper should go for?
Sure. I mean, I think rather than talking about grapes, region is a great way to approach stuff because grapes kind of, I mean, it varies, but most of the time they kind of take the shape of the hand that holds it. Like it's, you might have a Chenin in Vouvray that's like extremely ripe and, like almost viscous, like it's a little bit richer. And then you have something like right across the river in Mont-Louis that's going to be like a little bit more acid driven and kind of mineral driven. So kind of finding a place that you like. I mean, the Loire is a great place to start. That's where both of those places I was just mentioning is. It's that long river that we were talking about earlier. A lot of really well-priced wine comes out of the Loire, partially because it's like kind of a rustic like farming belt. And also people make a good amount of wine there, so I think that probably brings the price down too. So looking for like a nice Loire Valley Gamay, or Chenin's one of my favorites. There's some lesser known varietals like Pinot de Nice. That's a really tasty kind of like peppery herbaceous red that I really like. And then just kind of like finding a place and digging deeper into it, like finding out what the traditions are there. That can be like a really cool way of kind of deepening your knowledge. Alsace is definitely one of my favorite regions. That's in northern France. They make a lot of really interesting white wine. Not so much red. There's some really delicious Pinots that come out of there, but it's mostly like kind of crazy, Riesling, Sylvaner, some richer stuff, some leaner stuff, plenty of dry Riesling. I also want to not scare anybody, but also don't be scared of sweet wine in general. There's a time and a place. But yeah, I mean, I think that asking a wine shop steward, hey, I'm not super familiar with wine. But I'd like to be more familiar. Is there something at like X price point that you would recommend for someone who's just kind of getting into it? Like ask questions. These people that's why they're there, because they're excited to talk about wine with people. So, that would be one thing I would pass along to any young consumer is to ask questions and to be open. Not to, those that what we were kind of talking about earlier, like those preconceptions of what you like, maybe kind of try to leave those behind a little bit sometimes and just be more open. I mean, it's a pretty low risk investment, like if you don't like a wine, it's not really the end of the world. And especially if you're, there's plenty of options at like 20 and under that can kind of be nice, exploratory grounds for people. You just ask questions.
Yeah. And before I move on to our last question, we have a question from one of our guests.
Yeah, totally.
It's a long guest name, so I'm not going to read it, but they're asking, can natural wine be aged?
Yeah, totally. So aging wine doesn't have to do with the preservatives in it. So generally, like the rule of thumb that I've heard from people is that you want to look for a wine that has some degree of tannic structure, some degree of acidity, or both. Higher alcohol helps. But those kind of three factors, and sugar actually, those three factors lend themselves to wine that will age well. I mean, I share a little icebox with some friends, and it's all natural wine, and we're all planning on sitting on it for a minute. So yeah, you can definitely age wine. I mean, natural wine rather. But yeah, I mean, again, ask if you're at a wine shop and you're like, hey, I want to lay something down for a minute, and I'm interested in, X style, or it's yeah. Ask questions. But yeah, you can definitely age natural wine. It's just about like the structure of it. You can't just put like some, basically one good rule of thumb is if it's in a clear bottle, don't age it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming
thanks
to
for having
UCLA
me.
Radio today and having a chat with me. Yeah. The venue will be back next Tuesday at 11 a.m. On UCLAradio.com. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Do you want to say bye to our listeners?
Yeah, thank you guys. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you, and see you all next week.
Well, the moon's invitation